When you imagine a mother, you are reminded of a warm embrace, a loving, nurturing figure that is both caring and protective. A mother is supposed to be a safe haven, the one person who would never harm you. But this is not the reality for everyone. While some are blessed to have mothers who look after them, others are lying in their graves, awaiting justice for having their lives taken away by the very women who gave birth to them. The women who should have loved and cared for them, instead, chose to end their lives with cruelty that's difficult to comprehend. These are the stories of mothers who now sit behind bars, facing death sentences for the unimaginable horrors they committed. These are the cases of women who are awaiting death in prison after mercilessly killing their children. Darlie Routier. When you think of a mother on death row, the image that comes to mind probably isn't that of a blonde Texas housewife with a big smile and a picture-perfect life. But Darlie Routier went from a loving mother of 3 to one of the most infamous women on death row. Her case is one of the most controversial in true crime history. Was she a grieving mother wrongly accused, or a cold-blooded killer who staged a brutal attack? In the early hours of June 6, 1996, a frantic 911 call shattered the silence in an upscale Rowlett, Texas neighborhood. Darlie, bleeding from a knife wound to her throat, sobbed into the phone, screaming that an intruder had broken in and stabbed her 2 young sons, Devin and Damon. By the time paramedics arrived, the scene was straight out of a horror movie. Blood everywhere, 2 little boys clinging to life, and a mother seemingly on the brink of death herself. But as investigators dug deeper, cracks started forming in Darlie's story. Suspicion turned to her, leading to a shocking trial that divided the public. Some saw her as a heartbroken mother caught in a legal loophole, while others believed she was a calculating murderer who brutally killed her own children. So, what really happened that night? When police arrived within minutes, they were met with a gruesome scene. 6-year-old Devin and 5-year-old Damon lay bleeding from multiple stab wounds. Darlie herself had a deep slash across her throat. A possible break-in? That's what Darlie claimed. She told police she had fallen asleep on the couch with her boys while watching TV, only to wake up and see a strange man in her home. She said the man fled when she confronted him, dropping a knife as he ran. Panicking, she picked up the weapon before realizing she and her children had been attacked. At first glance, it seemed like a horrifying home invasion, but as investigators dug deeper, things weren't adding up. The garage window screen had been cut, which was an apparent entry point. But there was a problem. There were no footprints in the dirt below the window, and the dust on the windowsill remained undisturbed. Even stranger, there were no signs of blood or movement through the garage, the supposed escape route. And then there was the sock. 75 yards away from the Routier home, investigators found a blood-stained sock. Tests confirmed it contained the blood of both Devin and Damon. But how could an intruder, in the midst of a brutal attack, have had the time to carry a sock that far from the crime scene? Darlie's injuries were suspicious too. While her sons suffered fatal stab wounds, her wounds were described as superficial, deep enough to be dramatic, but not life-threatening. The slash on her throat came dangerously close to her carotid artery, but just missed. Then came the moment that sealed public opinion. Just 8 days after the murders, cameras captured Darlie at her sons' graves, smiling and spraying silly string as she and her family sang "Happy Birthday" to Devin. The sight of a mother laughing at her children's graves shocked the nation. Many saw it as the final proof they needed. Darlie wasn't mourning. She was celebrating. 4 days later, police arrested her for capital murder. On January 6, 1997, Darlie Routier's trial began in Kerrville, Texas. Prosecutors wasted no time painting her as a self-absorbed, materialistic woman who valued luxury over motherhood. Their theory was that she murdered her sons because of financial struggles, driven by greed and desperation. But was that motive really solid? Yes, the Routiers had money problems, but the boy's life insurance policy was only $10,000, barely enough to cover funeral costs. If Darlie was desperate for cash, why not target her husband, who had a much more substantial $800,000 policy? And why leave her youngest son, Drake, unharmed? The infamous silly string video was played in court, which shocked even the jury. The footage of Darlie laughing and celebrating at her children's graves seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. A grieving mother doesn't act like that, right? The prosecution called in crime scene experts who claimed the entire break-in had been staged. Blood spatter analyst Tom Bevel testified that cast-off blood on the back of Darlie's nightshirt suggested she had raised a knife over her head, consistent with stabbing, not self-defense. On the other hand, the bloody sock found 75 yards away complicated things. Damon was still alive when paramedics arrived, and the medical examiner estimated he could have only survived for about 8 minutes after being stabbed. But Darlie was on the phone with 911 for almost 6 minutes. If she had staged the scene, inflicted her own wounds, and planted the sock outside, that left her just 2 minutes to do it all. So was that even possible? The defense also brought up conflicting medical opinions. While one expert testified that Darlie's throat wound wasn't self-inflicted, her own doctors had initially suggested otherwise. Despite these doubts, the jury reached a verdict on February 1st. Darlie was found guilty. 3 days later, Darlie Routier was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She remains on Texas death row to this day. But even now, nearly 30 years later, her case continues to divide the public. Was she a victim of a rushed investigation, or was justice truly served? Christina Marie Riggs. Christina Riggs looked like any other young mother in Arkansas. A nurse by profession, she worked long hours and came home to her 2 small children, 5-year-old Justin and Shelby, just 2 years old. But behind closed doors, Christina was drowning in depression. Quiet, dangerous, and untreated. And one night in November of 1997, it all spiraled into horror. It was a night no one saw coming. Christina had made up her mind. She believed the world was too cruel, too broken, and she didn't want her children to live in it. So she planned what she thought would be a peaceful way out for all of them. Using her access to medical supplies, she injected her children with potassium chloride, a drug often used in lethal injections. But her plan didn't go as expected. The drug didn't work the way she thought it would. Her children didn't die right away. So she did the unthinkable. She smothered Justin and Shelby with her bare hands, making sure they wouldn't wake up ever again. Then Christina turned the needle on herself. She left a suicide note and tried to overdose. But she survived. And when emergency responders arrived, they found the lifeless bodies of her children and a mother who no longer wanted to live. Christina confessed right away. There were no alibis, no attempts to hide what she'd done. She told investigators that she was severely depressed and genuinely believed she was sparing her children from a lifetime of pain. She didn't blame anyone else, and she didn't beg for mercy. Mental health professionals later confirmed that Christina was suffering from major depression, but by then, the damage was done. 2 innocent lives were gone, and Christina's story had shaken the community to its core. In 1998, Christina was convicted of capital murder, but instead of fighting for her life, she waived all her appeals. She told the court she wanted to be executed, that it was the only punishment she could live with. And so, on May 2nd, 2 years later, Christina Marie Riggs was put to death by lethal injection. She became the first woman executed in Arkansas in over 150 years. Her case remains one of the most haunting examples of what untreated mental illness, despair, and hopelessness can lead to when help is out of reach. Christy Michelle Scott. August 16, 2008, Russellville, Alabama. It was the middle of the night when flames engulfed the home of 30-year-old Christy Michelle Scott. As the fire raged, Christy and her youngest son managed to escape, frantically seeking help from a neighbor. But inside, 6-year-old Mason Scott was trapped. By the time firefighters extinguished the fire, it was too late. Mason's lifeless body was found in his bedroom, burned beyond recognition. An unimaginable tragedy, or so it seemed. At first, the fire appeared to be a tragic accident, but as investigators sifted through the catastrophe, disturbing details emerged. The smoke detector, crucial for alerting Mason, had been removed. Toxicology reports revealed he had been drugged with cough syrup before the fire started. And the most disturbing evidence was Christy herself, who had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on Mason just 12 hours before his death. Christy Michelle Scott's trial began on June 12, 2009 in Franklin County Circuit Court. Prosecutors argued that Christy had deliberately set the fire that killed her 6-year-old son Mason in order to collect a total of $175,000 in insurance money. Investigators also revealed Christy's history of suspicious fires, including 2 previous fires at her own home and others at her relatives' houses. They claimed this pattern pointed to a willingness to resort to arson for financial gain. Throughout the trial, Christy denied any involvement in the fire. She insisted she had no knowledge of how it started and maintained that she had tried to save Mason. Her defense argued that there was no direct evidence linking her to the fire's origin and that she had no reason to kill her son. Despite her claims, the evidence against her continued to mount. The medical examiner testified that Mason had inhaled large amounts of smoke, meaning he had been alive and struggling to breathe for a period before he ultimately gave up. After nearly a month of testimony, on July 8th, the jury found Christy guilty of 3 counts of capital murder: the murder of a child under the age of 14, murder in the commission of arson, and murder for pecuniary gain. Under Alabama law, any of these charges made her eligible for either life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. During the sentencing phase, the jury decided Christy's fate. The majority voted for life in prison without parole, with 7 jurors opting for life and 5 voting for the death penalty. However, under Alabama's judicial override system at the time, the trial judge had the power to disregard the jury's recommendation. So, on August 5th, Judge Terry Dempsey overruled the jury's decision and sentenced Scott to death by lethal injection. In his ruling, Judge Dempsey emphasized the cruel and calculated nature of the crime, as Christy had intentionally drugged her child with cough syrup, removed the smoke detector, and set the fire while he was asleep. He described Mason's final moments as horrifying, saying that, even if the victim, Mason, succumbed to smoke inhalation before being burned, it would still have been a horrible death. Struggling to breathe and trying to escape would be terrifying for the young child. Christy was immediately transferred to Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she became the 3rd woman in Alabama to be sentenced to death since 2002. Her case caused significant debate within the community. Many residents of Russellville were shocked that Judge Dempsey had overridden the jury's recommendation for life without parole. But others believed the death sentence was appropriate given the horrific nature of Mason's murder. Franklin County District Attorney Joey Rushing supported the decision, stating that justice had been served. Shortly after her sentencing, Christy's defense team filed an appeal for a new trial, arguing that she had been wrongfully convicted. However, in September, Judge Dempsey denied the motion. Over the following years, Scott's lawyers continued to appeal, but each attempt to overturn her sentence failed. In 2017, Alabama abolished judicial override, a law that had previously allowed judges to overrule jury sentencing recommendations in capital cases. However, the new legislation was not applied retroactively, meaning Scott's death sentence remained in place. A later effort to make the law retroactive failed, leaving Scott among 30 death row inmates sentenced under judicial override. In September 2015, Scott filed a new appeal, this time claiming ineffective legal counsel during her original trial. However, as of 2025, her sentence has not been overturned. She remains on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. Her execution date is yet to be set. Lisa Ann Coleman. Lisa Ann Coleman's story is the kind that makes your stomach turn. It's not just about a crime. It's about prolonged suffering, cruelty, and a child trapped in a nightmare that he never escaped. When paramedics arrived at a home in Arlington, Texas, they had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse the state had ever seen. Inside, they found 9-year-old Devontai Williams, lifeless, frail, and covered in bruises. Something was horribly wrong. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a horrifying truth, one that would land Lisa Ann Coleman on Texas death row. On the morning of July 26, 2004, paramedics rushed to an Arlington, Texas, apartment after a mother made a desperate 911 call. Marcella Williams claimed that her 9-year-old son, Devontai, had stopped breathing. But when responders arrived at the scene, what they found was beyond heartbreaking. Devontai, weighing only 35 pounds, roughly half the normal weight for a child his age, was already showing signs of rigor mortis. The young boy's frail, malnourished body was a haunting signal of the suffering he had endured in his final days. A subsequent autopsy confirmed the bitter truth. Devontai had died from malnutrition, with pneumonia as a contributing factor. His body had been severely undernourished, and he had clearly been deprived of the basic sustenance that any child needs to survive. But the horror didn't end with his death. Investigations revealed a pattern of neglect that had been there in Devontai's life since he was an infant. Marcella and Lisa had kept Devontai isolated, refusing to send him to school and concealing his existence from the authorities. School officials, unable to reach the family, were left unaware of the abuse that was taking place behind closed doors. The boy had been hidden away in plain sight, suffering from neglect while his mother and her partner tried to cover up the damage they had caused. The abuse was not new either. In fact, this wasn't the first time child welfare officials had stepped in. At the age of 4, Devontai had been removed from his mother's custody after CPS found evidence of physical abuse. His mother had been accused of beating him with an extension cord, and his younger sister had also been removed from the home for similar reasons. He was placed in foster care, but Marcella Williams regained custody after promising to stay away from Coleman. The cycle of abuse, however, was far from over. In 2002, 2 years before Devontai's death, another CPS investigation had been opened after concerns were raised about his medical neglect. His mother and Coleman had begun hiding him from school authorities, keeping him away from medical care, and keeping him confined to their apartment. Though caseworkers tried multiple times to check on the boy, they were repeatedly denied access to him, as Marcella and Coleman continued to avoid scrutiny. Lisa Ann Coleman and Marcella Williams were both arrested and initially charged with injury to a child. As the investigation unfolded, however, it became clear that the abuse wasn't just an unfortunate series of events. It was deliberate, ongoing cruelty. Devontai had been locked away in a pantry, deprived of food and beaten regularly, his tiny body covered in scars. The extent of his suffering was unimaginable. The malnutrition that led to his death was compounded by pneumonia, leaving Devontai's body physically shattered and unrecognizable. Authorities soon upgraded the charges against Coleman and Williams to capital murder. As prosecutors began to piece together the horrific details, they pointed to the fact that Devontai had been kidnapped, bound, and locked in a pantry by both women as the aggravating factor that allowed for the capital murder charge. It was during this time that Coleman made a horrific confession. She admitted that she had struck Devontai with a belt, and at times, alongside Marcella, tied him up. Marcella Williams decided to plead guilty to murder, accepting a life sentence in exchange for sparing herself the trial. But Lisa Ann Coleman wasn't backing down. She rejected the plea deal and chose to face a jury. Her defense attorney, Michael Heiskell, tried to show a different perspective. He argued that Devonti's death wasn't premeditated murder, but the tragic result of bad parenting. He claimed that Coleman didn't even live with Marcella and Devonti, and tried to blame Devonti's frail, malnourished body on his premature birth, not abuse. But the jury wasn't swayed. They were about to hear the truth, and it was far more horrific than they could have imagined. The prosecution came prepared, laying out the facts with unsettling truths. They revealed how, despite the house being full of food, Devonti was deliberately starved. His tiny, battered body bore the marks of repeated beatings, scars and bruises covering his skin like a map of his suffering. One of the most haunting testimonies came from Dr. Daniel Konzelman, the medical examiner, who explained just how dire Devonti's condition had become. His body was so malnourished that his muscles had begun to break down, and his wounds were so severe that they couldn't heal. It was clear to everyone in that courtroom, Devonti wasn't just neglected, he was tortured, and the jury could see it. Devonti's teacher spoke out during the trial, sharing how the young boy struggled in school. Despite his difficulties, it was clear he had the potential to learn, but his behavioral issues and the constant abuse at home held him back. This was a child who, with the right support and love, could have thrived. As the full story of his abuse came to light, the jury couldn't ignore the horrors Devonti had faced. They handed down a death sentence for Lisa Ann Coleman, holding her accountable for the pain she caused. But Coleman's legal team wasn't ready to give up. They argued that the kidnapping charge against her was invalid, claiming there was no solid proof that Devonti had been taken from a public place and locked away in the pantry. But those efforts failed. The court stood firm, and Coleman's conviction remained intact. In the end, on September 17, 2014, Lisa Ann Coleman was executed by lethal injection. After years of legal battles, she was finally held accountable for the life she destroyed. Her execution was a painful, tragic end to a case that had already cost an innocent child his life. And though the legal system had moved forward with her punishment, the case was far from over. The aftermath raised serious questions about the role of Child Protective Services, CPS, and the failures that allowed a vulnerable child to slip through the cracks, despite multiple investigations, despite the warning signs. Devonti's death exposed just how far-reaching the failure was, and how much more needed to be done to protect children like him from the horrors of abuse. After this tragedy, CPS came under fire, and the Texas government initiated reviews into how they handled cases like Devonti's. The case sparked public outrage and calls for better child protection laws, but for Devonti, it was all too late. His death will always serve as a reminder of the devastating consequences when those who are supposed to care for children instead subject them to unimaginable pain. Susan Eubanks. This is a story of a mother who has haunted San Marcos, California for over 20 years. It's about a woman named Susan Eubanks, whose name became infamous after a deadly night in 1997. On October 26th, Susan shot and killed her 4 young sons, aged 4, 6, 7, and 14, each in the head, before turning the gun on herself. But she didn't die. She survived the shot. And what happened that night is a story that starts with a fit of rage and a series of decisions that still haunt the neighborhood today. The day of the killings started off with a bitter argument between Susan and her boyfriend, the father of her youngest child. The day started with tensions and turned into rage, and that evening, Susan's estranged husband, fearing for the safety of their family, called the authorities for a welfare check. Deputies broke down the door, and what they found was horrific. 3 of the boys were dead. The 4th, barely clinging to life, would die later in the hospital. A 6-year-old nephew of Susan's, though, was left unharmed. But Susan, she had shot herself in a desperate attempt to end her life. and then a trial ensued. Prosecutors said Susan was driven by anger, by revenge against the men in her life. They argued she killed her children in cold blood. On the other hand, Susan's defense didn't quite cover her whole life story. They didn't bring up the mental health issues that had been part of Susan's life for years. The history of trauma, physical and sexual abuse, a brain damaged by fetal alcohol syndrome, all these details were left out. They didn't argue that Susan's actions might have been rooted in her own tragic past, a past that included growing up without her mother, who died in a house fire when Susan was just 8. In 1999, when the trial happened, even the judge saw that something was missing. She wondered why no one had raised mental health as part of the defense, but it was too late. Susan was sentenced to death. Fast forward to 2024. After years of legal battles, a decision was made. Instead of dragging the case through another trial, prosecutors agreed to resentencing Susan to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It meant she would never get out. But the decision to reduce her death sentence didn't take away the horror of what she did. It didn't change the fact that those 4 young boys, in the blink of an eye, lost their lives at their mother's hands. And it didn't change the fact that Susan Eubanks would live the rest of her life in prison because of it. In the silence of their prison cells, awaiting their fate, these mothers must now live with the weight of their actions. But does the death penalty give true justice for the lives they took? Or is it merely another chapter in a cycle of irreversible pain? As we reflect on these chilling stories, we must ask ourselves, how far does the darkness go when it comes from the very person who should have been our light? If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you for watching.